Having longevity as an author means being able to adapt and change. Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. I'm Kristin Donnelly, and I'm here with Molly Stevens and Kate Leahy. Our guest is someone who has written 7 cookbooks over the past 20 years. She inspires us every day with her commitment to producing excellent books, while also experimenting with many different types of media, from blogging to audio to article writing to Instagram to Substack. She is truly a rock star, and we are also happy to call her a friend. Can you guess who it is? This week, we're putting our very own Andrea Nguyen in the hot seat to talk about her latest book, Evergreen Vietnamese. Andrea, welcome to Everything Cookbooks.
Oh my goodness, so glad to be here, y'all.
Andrea, we're here to talk about your latest book, Evergreen Vietnamese. Congratulations. This is a big book. There's so much genius in it. We've talked about behind your back how there's just so much to learn in this book. Like, even if you don't make a full recipe, I feel like every recipe has this takeaway, just the way you use ingredients and these very cool hacks. What about you, Molly and Kate?
I had the same feeling. It feels very fresh, and part of that's the subject matter, but there's so much confidence in it. It's so packed with information, sidebars. But as you said, Kristin, in the recipes themselves, I was really blown away by how much I was learning just flipping through it. And cooking from it. Just made the tofu mushroom curry.
Oh, nice.
And the 10-10-10 rice, which is like complete game changer.
One of the things I love about the book is, Andrea, you're such a teacher. And this book really highlights how much you know, but also your way of just like easily guiding people in the kitchen without it feeling so hard. And I think that's all the attention you spent on those little bursts that I think we've talked about on the podcast. But now we get to see what you were talking about. It's in a different font color. It's green, and it just tricks your eye into seeing something new. So reading that, you can actually, if you just read the bursts, you'd come away with a little bit of this education. I guess what I'm saying, in not the most glamorous way, is that it's a really layered book. You can go into it and just cook a recipe, or you can really dive in and learn a lot about how to be a better cook.
Totally. Yeah. Did it start off being this big, Andrea?
I had no idea. So, you like sign those contracts, you guys, and we've talked about how we sign those contracts, and we have a word count, we have a page count, we have a trim size. And I just started writing, and my editor, Lorena Jones, just kind of said, just keep kind of running with it. And in the past, I had an editor who was very much into sticking with what was in the contract in terms of size, length, word count, and she would make me cut. I learned to edit myself fairly well. But on this book, Lorena actually said, write more. I was ready to make it sort of like Vietnamese Food Any Day, where it's just like really tight, going in there and saying, this is how you can make dishes with mostly vegetables, a near vegetarian Vietnamese cookbook. But Lorena's like, no, go big. Write, for example, a lengthy introduction for every single chapter so that it really pulls the reader in. In the past, I was just sort of, in the past few books, just listing the recipes at the front of the chapter. And she said, people aren't really going to be looking at that. We're going to put all that in the front of the table of contents. Give people something to read. Mm-hmm. And so all of a sudden I was like, how many words do I get in these introductions, Lorena? And she gave me a word count. I more or less wrote to that word count. And then we went from there into layout. So the book actually expanded to I think it started out at around 80,000 words or something like that. And then it went to 100, and then it went up to 110, and then it settled around 90,000.
Wow. And how many recipes?
All told, there are over 125 recipes plus variations.
Yeah.
And, it's so weird how we count recipes, right?
It is. Totally. Yeah.
Because there's the actual recipes that are listed in the table of contents. But I was like, hey, wait a second. We have all these variations that are tested.
Yeah.
And I wanted those to count too. But you're always looking forward thinking, I don't want that one person to be counting all the recipes in the table of contents and going, hey, wait a second, you only have 95.
Right.
But all of the variations are tested. And this is something that I really wanted to do in this book because my testers were like, I'm going to test that. And I wanted them to, because that's where like the fun part of this book is like, you've got a recipe. I'm going to show you where you can take it.
Yep. There's a lot of off-roading and
exactly, because that's what people are going to do, right?
Well, and it goes back to what you were saying before, is that by giving all those lessons, there's all this permission. You're hoping that's what our people are going to do. Let's talk about how the book came about, Andrea. You write about this in the introduction, but you surveyed your online community. Curious how that survey helped shape the book, and if you were surprised by the direction.
Well, I wanted to write an elemental Vietnamese cookbook. This notion of Vietnamese food being fresh and being produce-based. But I didn't want it to be a vegetarian cookbook because I'm not a vegetarian. I'm not going to pretend to be one. I've got this behemoth ingredient looming. The elephant in the room is that big bottle of fish sauce that people are always going to say, what are you going to do? How do you deal with fish sauce with vegetarian food, right? I also thought about sustainability and what that means to me. It means the environment. It also means like whether or not you can really sustain this kind of eating in the long run. So I wanted to write this low meat book. My publisher said, well, we can really sell a vegetarian book. And I was like, but I'm not vegetarian. And I think that there are more people who just want to eat more vegetables. So that's why I sent that survey out. There were well over 1,300 people who responded. There was this whole, trajectory I saw during 2020 that people just wanted to be flexitarian. Also, vegetarians, the people who are in my virtual online community, they are not dogmatic. And the reality of who is at our table and who we cook for now is very different than it was 5 years ago. So if you're a parent, you may have children in junior high, high school, college who are like, I'm going to be a vegetarian, but you may not. And so you're like, how do you accommodate all of these different, this diversity of food preferences at your table? So that's where I thought, you know what, that's just like how Vietnamese people have been like cooking for a long time.
Yeah.
And that survey proved that point. And, most of my people are not Vietnamese, and so I thought, well, this is proof that this can work.
So the survey allowed you to show to your publisher that you were on the right track.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be a vegetarian book. It can be a veg-forward book.
Yeah, those terms, right? They lock us in so much because it's about marketing and branding. So it's just a vegetable-centric, vegetable-forward, plant-based. It's just about eating more plants and really honoring what the planet gives to us. And shoot, it is darn fun.
Yeah.
Kristin, you've done so much work on the Chef's Garden book. Vegetables are like where it's happening.
Yeah. Well, there's so much possibility and flavors and textures and parts of a plant and all of that. That's cool. You got to explore that.
And I love that you say plants from the land and the sea.
Me too. I love that. Yeah.
Right.
A nice point of distinction.
Yeah, because people think of plants just being in the soil, but, seaweed is like a huge thing and a huge source of piscine, umami, and also kind of like, that kind of gelatinous quality of kombu. And I used seaweed to make vegan fish sauce. So I did find a way to get around that fish sauce elephant in the room.
We have to talk about that recipe because I want to know how you came up. Not any spoilers here, but there's pineapple juice in this recipe. So how did these flavors come together in your mind to think, this is how I'm going to make a vegan fish sauce that really gets that savory flavor that you need, that fish sauce needs to give a dish? Like, because this doesn't seem like the easiest recipe to develop.
Well, for many years, I've been looking at vegetarian fish sauce that was sold at Vietnamese markets. For a long time, they were already kind of like blended with sugar and chilies, and it was just like this bottle of like nước chấm dipping sauce that you would buy, and it came from Vietnam. And then in the past few years, there has been vegan fish sauce that came from Vietnam that were flavored with mushroom, and then one had pineapple juice. And they all had flavor enhancers in them of some sort, MSG, monosodium glutamate, which is, like friendly nowadays in many people's kitchens, not, vilified, but they had preservatives in them. And I had no idea how these new vegan fish sauces came together, but I thought, first of all, they're sold only in a very limited number of Vietnamese markets. Number two, the brands really shift. So for me to point to a particular brand for people to go look for. And if they don't find it, then I'm not helping them. So I thought, how can I do this on my own? And shoot, you can. And so I developed my own recipe with pineapple juice, and I have you filter it, and then there's, seaweed in there and other ingredients. The pineapple gives it this slightly fermenty quality. And the thing is, I say in the recipe, if you walk through this recipe, it's like whether you're vegetarian, vegan or not, you totally understand all of a sudden how you can build this ladder of flavors, this umami-ness, mimic the quality of fish sauce. And it's so incredibly awesome and fun that you end up with this amber color liquid that you can, use 1-to-1 with regular fish sauce.
And it lasts like a month, right?
Yeah, at least.
Okay, at least. Okay.
Even longer. I mean, it
sounds like a magic trick.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is a magic trick.
And you mentioned MSG, which I went back to your very first book, Into the Vietnamese Kitchen, where you actually talk about how you didn't use MSG at the time in your cooking. And then you come out pro MSG. And what's that evolution been like?
It's this ingredient that is used in Vietnamese cooking by a lot of hardcore Vietnamese cooks. My mother, she, for many years, had me buy a giant container of accent at restaurant supply stores for her. And I was like, Mom, you can just buy Ajinomoto, at the Asian market. And she's like, what? I only want to use American-made MSG. And I knew it was going on in like her kitchen and other Vietnamese kitchens, but it's such a touchy subject. And it was a touchy subject back in 2006 to put MSG into food. And I really didn't need it because, when you have a lot of animal protein in your dishes, you've got that umami there. And there are fish sauces such as Three Crabs fish sauce that has an ingredient in there called hydrolyzed wheat protein. And I'm just going to geek out here with y'all here because that is really glutamate. And a lot of traditional fish sauces have glutamates in them. They have MSG in them. So I was like, I don't need to add MSG. I don't need to add this ingredient to my recipes, to my first book. But in this one, when I was like working with vegetables, I thought, you know what? I just need to like that little push just to like send things over the top. And we're talking, this is, now 2022, 2023. People are looking at MSG going, it's not as bad as we thought. Okay, come on, it's in Doritos.
Totally. It's in so much process. I mean, not that we're advocating eating Doritos, but like the tiny amount that you're going to use
Yeah, and people want to learn how to use it.
Yeah.
So I thought this is my opportunity to just, in a handful of recipes where it's pivotal, where I'm just going to say, you know what, you're just going to like push your flavors, just boom, over. And there's been a lot of questions about MSG being bad for you. And then now it's more like, I kind of got over MSG being bad for me. How do I use it? In Vietnamese cooking, there is also like MSG substitutes, flavor enhancers that are made with mushrooms that are devoid of monosodium glutamate. So, if you set foot into a Vietnamese market, you're going to find an entire end cap full of flavor enhancers.
It actually makes me think just a little bit of when we talked with Emily Meggett, and like she uses all these seasoning salts. That's like really the thing that makes her food so extra craveable and delicious. And sometimes in those seasoning salts, there's MSG or other kind of flavor enhancer. So it's not unusual.
And to Molly's point earlier at the top, where she said I sounded much more confident, and shoot, I mean, I'm 54 years old now. And I feel that as a cook and a writer, I am much more confident now. I don't want to hold back. I want to be true. I want to tell my readers, this is what you can do with your food. This is how I cook. And these are the parameters for doing it without making it seem overwhelming. That's where I am in my life now as a writer. I think like when I was starting out, it was kind of like, oh, well, I got to like really stay true to what I find is what my mother did, what others did. And then I don't really want to show them everything about the MSG thing because then people are going to be like, no, I don't want to do that. But here I'm just like, you have options. And readers and cooks can choose where they want to be.
Yeah. Yeah, that really comes through in the pantry section of this book too. It's incredible, and it's very opinionated. You talk about brands and everything. I think it's the biggest pantry section in all of your books, maybe. Kristin, you and I were talking about this a little bit. How some people say they don't like the pantry sections.
I love it.
But you say that in the book. You call it out. You say a lot of people skip this section, but since you're reading it, I know you're not one of those people.
It's validation, baby.
So it's like you're giving us a peek behind the curtain in this book a lot more. You're letting the readers in on the process of making the book in the book itself. Whereas I think in the first book, you want to have that authority to say this story. And I was reading actually, though, your introduction to your first book, and man, it stands up to the test of time. You still sound like you. It's really amazing. In this book, though, you're just giving us a peek behind the curtain of what it's like to actually develop recipes and make this book.
Well, I got to credit things to, a certain extent to Everything Cookbooks and our conversations here, pulling the curtain back on the wizard, so to speak. Letting people into our kitchens and letting people know what it takes to put together a cookbook, because we do this for strangers. Mm-hmm. We have all of these things going on in our heads as we're making a cookbook, and writing during the pandemic was difficult. Doing everything during the pandemic was difficult. And I was just like, I'm just going to really tell you what I think. And I just don't want you to skip this section. There is so much filtering and editing that goes where we want to appear perfectly polished and authoritative. But I thought to myself, I'm going to be authoritative by taking you by the hand a little bit and saying to you, I know what you're thinking. You don't want to look in the pantry section because it's so effing boring. But honestly, this is where cookbook writers put all of our magic tricks.
Yeah, and share our little nuggets our little philosophical nuggets, I guess, that you don't want to put in every single recipe, right?
Yeah, and why not let people know that so that it's not boring? Because, we've all been reading cookbooks for a very long time, and I always scan the pantry or basics, essentials section of a book, especially chef ones, because I know that's all the stuff that they're grabbing at, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I also think you could tell a lot about a cookbook by the pantry section. If you go through it and it's very rote, it feels borrowed, or it feels like you've read it all before, I'm like, To me, that colors my impression of the rest of the book, perhaps. But if I get into a pantry section and it's really opinionated and it's personal and it comes from experience, you're like, okay, this is interesting. This is like opening up somebody's kitchen cabinet. I mean, and now I'm like, okay, what's in here? How many vinegars do you have? Really? Come on. What are the brands? Those are the things we want to know.
Totally. What do you really think about this?
Yeah, because I also think there's so much, we all know we're supposed to use whatever the kosher salt is, or we're supposed to be down on this. But what are we really using? Are we just saying that because that's the standard line, or that's what's trendy? Or, we just use fine salt because we prefer fine salt. I mean, to me, that's where it gets very interesting.
Yeah.
What do we really do? Yeah. Eric Kim has this thing with Morton's kosher salt versus Diamond Crystal, for example.
Yes, he
And
does.
he's just like, I'm a Morton's person because you can't find Diamond Crystal. For me, I'm just a fine salt person because that's more in line with what Vietnamese people use. And also, I tell people things and I just do a little math. Consider how much sodium is in your seasonings and then just guesstimate around that. Be a smart cook, because that's what I do.
What was the hardest recipe to get right? Because one of the things that sets this book apart is just how many new ideas there are in this book. I mean, there's a lot of recipes here. I'm looking at them and I'm thinking this must have taken a lot of iterations to get right. Just because when you are maybe taking out beef from something that classically has beef, or you're taking out pork or something, and you're trying to infuse it with water chestnuts and mushrooms and all these other kinds of ingredients. This must have been a big challenge. Here you are, it's in a pandemic situation, getting ingredients, testing these recipes. Was there one that was just the one that you're like, man, I got to get this right?
It was a cake recipe.
A cake recipe, of course.
It's the
marble one?
The mocha cake.
Yeah.
I think I mentioned it to you
Oh, you
guys.
did. You did.
Yes.
Yeah,
Oh my
yeah.
God. I baked that thing 30 times at least, starting in 2020. I didn't realize why there had never been a cake baked with sweetened condensed milk where I just wanted like a dump and stir. You know, I was like, there's so many people who like think that Asian desserts are like worthless or they're too weird. And I was like, no, I want to make a Vietnamese coffee cake, but not like a coffee cake in the American sense of a coffee cake, but one that tasted like Vietnamese coffee. I thought, how hard can that be? It was very hard because condensed milk does some very odd things to a cake batter. I was getting these tunnels that looked like there had been like a earthquake that ran through the oven. And at the same time, I was remodeling my kitchen during the pandemic. So the construction people would arrive like around 8:30 or something. And I would get up at like 6:30 or 7, hook up the stove to the gas, mix up my batter, bake the cake before they got there, pulled it out. And then, you know, it would be cooling by the time the construction got started. I was like calling all my lifelines, different chef friends and stuff. And they're like, oh, I've never done that before. I was like, tunnels. And it took a while to figure out how to get rid of those tunnels and to tame that cake. And it's like the most delicious cake. I never regretted taking a bite of it at any time. My mother absolutely loves it. And it does taste like Vietnamese coffee in a cake.
It's so cool you got there too, because I feel like sometimes I have these things in my head, start testing toward them, and I often do give up after like 5 times. I love that you like stuck with it because you knew it was going to be great.
It's just like closer and closer and closer.
That it tasted good. Like what you said, that you never regretted tasting it. That to me might have kept me going, because it's when the idea is there, but you taste it and you're like, it's just not worth it.
Yeah.
That's easier to give up. But if there's the flavor is there, you're like, I just got to get it right. It reminds me of speaking to Dory Greenspan, because it's about the flavor, and it's about getting it not just so it works, but that you know it's going to work for every cook that tries it. And that's where things like tunnels and cracks, and those are upsetting results in a cake. So you need to iron those out if you can.
Yeah. And during the book shoot, my food stylist, Karen Shinto, she did something. I can't remember what. And she was straining the cake batter. And I was like, Karen, what the hell are you doing? She goes, I screwed up. And there's like lumps and stuff. I can't remember what I did. And blah, blah, blah. She strained the cake batter. She baked it up, and it was like perfect. And one of my testers is a pastry chef who's been a friend of mine since the 1990s. Maki, she would just like dive in and cook whatever. And she just like baked up this cake. And I said, so how was it, Maki? She goes, perfect. Like the perfect bake. And I was like, seriously? She goes, oh yeah. You know, I just like used whatever I had. And I was like, all right.
Awesome.
Validation.
It was worth it.
Yeah. It was worth it.
Yeah.
And now we all can make it because you spent 30 times to perfect it.
Yes. And it freezes beautifully.
Awesome. Andrea, you were talking about Vietnamese cooks, whether they're in Vietnam, perhaps, but often in the diaspora. But then you're also writing for cooks who are not Vietnamese at all and maybe don't have experience, you know, maybe a little bit. So how do you balance that in general?
So in Vietnamese Food Any Day, which was published in 2019, all of the ingredients came from the American supermarket. You did not have to set foot into an Asian market. And that book has done exceedingly well. And at the time when that book came out, I felt like, oh my gosh, are there going to be people who point to me and say, you're inauthentic because you're not really shopping at a Vietnamese market or an Asian market for these ingredients? But at the same time, I knew that there were Asian cooks. I'd meet them at events and they'd be like, does this require going to an Asian market? And I said, no. And they said, oh, thank God, thank you. Because you know what? There has to be this normalization of Asian food where we don't think of it as something that's exotic, where we don't think of it as something that's relegated to the weekends. And that really has to do with, you know, first and foremost, accessible ingredients. So with this book, Evergreen Vietnamese, I started off asking my editor, Lorena Jones, do you want all the ingredients to come from a regular supermarket? And she said, no. At first, I was like 10%. She said, no, make it 15 to 20% has to come from the Asian market. So we set like a little...
like a threshold, kind of.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Because the point is now, we're 4 years after Vietnamese Food Any Day came out, and people are much more curious about Asian food in a manner that didn't exist before. And, honestly, that is part of the whole Stop Asian Hate thing. Asian culture has currency. People want to honor and respect different cuisines now more than ever. So people want to shop at Asian markets or shop online. There are so many more ingredients available. And I was like, all right, there are certain times where I'm just going to use an ingredient that I really love that I would have kind of held back on if I were writing Vietnamese food any day, like certain kind of noodle products. For example, there is a recipe in the book for what are called la lot beef rolls. And la lot is a very interesting leaf in Southeast Asia. When you bite into it, it releases this kind of incense quality, this kind of aroma and flavor. It's almost curry-like, and it's wonderful. You can eat it raw in Thai cooking as wrapping foods up, or Vietnamese people tend to eat it cooked. And we wrap a filling of ground meat in it. And I was like, I'm going to do la lot. And it's called la lot, L-A-L-O-T. And I had a version in Vietnamese Food Any Day. And here I was like, I'm going to put those leaves in there. Even though they're only available certain times of the year when the weather's warm, I'm just going to do it because I'm betting my money that it's going to become popular. So as a writer, I'm always kind of thinking like, where is this going to be? Where's this cuisine going? And if I don't push it, who is?
Exactly. Right? Yeah.
So for that recipe, I went back to the way I'd been making it for years, and I always used ground meat. It tended to dry up, but I realized that if I combine ground meat with tofu, the tofu absorbed moisture and my rolls were beautiful, tender, and the moisture really picked up the flavors and stuff. And the rolls are just absolutely delicious. And then, so that was like problem number one, right? Like cutting down the meat. So I got to cut down the meat, got to use my friend Mr. Tofu. I got to use my leaf. And then I was like, what if I didn't have those leaves? What if I'm just like in the middle of nowhere or in California during the cold winter season when I can't get those leaves? So I thought, I use another leaf. Or maybe I don't need to use the leaf. So all of those options are built into that recipe. In addition to the fact that you can like cook them on an outdoor grill, or you can do it on a stovetop grill or in a skillet. All of those things are built into a recipe that also includes like process shots. So it's like trying to take people in many different directions on different levels of complexity so that they can experience what is a very important, iconic dish in the Vietnamese repertoire. That's the kind of thing that I really dug being able to do in Evergreen Vietnamese.
Mm. One of the things as someone who's been writing about food for a very long time and that just continually impresses me with your work is how inspired it is. And there's so many fresh and creative ideas. We've spoken before in this podcast about having parameters can force even greater creativity. Just wondering for people who've been at it for a long time, how do you stay inspired, Andrea?
I think about the cooks.
Yeah.
Right? We think about our audience really thoughtfully. I'm not ever going to be in a position where I'm a restaurant chef that can call for all different kinds of different gadgets, different high-level ingredients, because that's really, honestly, not particularly helpful to cooks. I want my food and my cuisine to be usable and relatable to people all over from different walks of life. I want to make my recipes useful but not dumbed down. So how do you do that? And then food is changing so much. Mm-hmm. So the cover shot for Evergreen Vietnamese is of this incredible hack that I love for making bánh cuốn, which are these steamed rice noodle rolls. The filling uses rice cauliflower, an ingredient that I've had a love-hate relationship with. Because so many people use rice cauliflower as a substitute for rice. And I was like, no, rice is rice. Mm-hmm. Rice is life, as you know, Kristin, from your work on the rice book. And I was like, what can I do with rice cauliflower? When I tasted it one day, I was like, oh, it's kind of like meat, like ground meat, texturally. Mm-hmm. So you think about, suddenly when you're looking at a vegetable and different textures and flavors, you're like, oh, wow. What is it that about meat that really gets us excited, and how do we define that experience? And for rice cauliflower, I thought, oh, it's nubby, these little nubs like ground meat when you like mash it up and you cook it. So I can like mimic that. That was, really inspiring because I was like, here's an ingredient that I found to be so problematic despite its popularity. And I'm not going to jump on a trend train just because it's trendy, because I really have to love it. people trust me to point them in a particular direction. So in that regard, what's happening in food inspires me, Molly, but also the inspiration is to make something that's really delicious and full of discovery for cooks at home and for me too. You know what? I mean, like, we have to own it.
And enjoy it, right? You got to stand behind it. It's cool with that recipe in particular too. The banh kun. You talk about like a lot of Vietnamese cooks have kind of created this like hack to work with use the rice papers to make them, right?
Yeah.
How do you stay up with what other Vietnamese home cooks are doing?
I listen to what's going on in social media. I am capable in reading and understanding a certain amount of Vietnamese, kitchen Vietnamese, cooking Vietnamese. And so I just stay in touch that way. I also have strangely curious parents. And when my dad was alive, he would send me like stuff he'd find. And my mom now, she does that because they have this entire email conversation with their friends. And their friends want to understand things. And their friends are like, well, will that work? You know, my mom's like, I don't know, but maybe interesting to Andrea. I'll send it to her.
Oh, that's cool.
So I get like information from a lot of different directions. And then I try to figure out, well, is that something that works? Is it something that's valuable? You know, I'm a translator or transmitter of information, I feel. So I have some original ideas, but not that many. I mean,
oh, please. All new ideas are basically composites of other ideas.
Right.
Yeah,
So-
I think
And you're
so.
just being a beat reporter. You're being like the best beat reporter where now, since you're known in the field, people now are sending you things because they know
Yeah.
you're on the scene. So
Yeah.
And you also have a pretty good bullshit detector too.
that's true.
So if it doesn't work, or if it's not real, if it's just a hack for the sake of hacking something that doesn't need to be hacked, you're not on that bus.
No, I'm not on that bus, man. And, you know, like going back to like my my tofu book, Asian Tofu, years ago, I was really interested in tofu. But one of the things that got me really going was when my mom emailed me. She says, I have a friend who is asking for a friend, Mrs. So-and-so, who recently moved from Vietnam to Africa. And she doesn't have tofu. The ladies and I want to know, do you know how to make tofu? And I was like, what? And these 70-something women who grew up with local tofu shops around the corner and whatnot, they want to know how to make tofu. And I'd been thinking about it, and I thought, if there's a convergence of generations, it's happening right here in the little soybean. So you never know, and I think that you just want to keep your eyes, ears, and mouth open to see what's going on.
So one thing, too, that I thought it would be interesting to talk about is just how much fun you have with, you know, chapter titles. How do you put a book together? Tell us a couple of your favorite sort of titles for your table of contents and just where the ideas came from.
Kate, I'm so glad you asked. Who else would ask me about
Well,
my
I mean,
chapter
we are
titles?
reading cookbooks. If you're going to geek out on, you know, titles of chapters, it's going to be
Because those chapter titles took so long.
serious. Oh, tell us. Spill the beans.
You know, yeah, in the past it'd be like pantry, snacks, soups, banh mi, meat. You know, it's like I'm doing my Ira Glass imitation right there. But here I was like, how can I frame the chapter so that people see that there is this magic, that they're going to get something in there that is different. So I thought to myself, what is like the one theme, if I were like to throw out a title for that chapter that could just like hook people so that they open it up, then I'm there. And it has to be short because you can only fit so much on a line or 2 lines. And we take a look at character count, at least I did, in the design. Because, you know, I send in like my shortest chapter titles and my longest chapter title, and we take a look at what they look like in layout. So I'm thinking about all those things and chapter placement too. So how the order of the chapters, right? So first, let's talk about the title. You know, I wanted them to be fun, but like you say, you know, snack sensations. It's like, woo, it's like something kind of exciting there. And rice transformations, for example, speaks to the different ways that you can manipulate rice flour and rice products and different kinds of rice. And I really felt like that was the transformation this journey that I could take readers on from making basic rice to maybe like using rice flour or maybe grinding rice up or using rice paper in ways that they've never done before. And I thought, well, that's a transformative process. I'm going to use that. 2 words. Banh mi possibilities. I'm just like, you think you know banh mi? No, there is so much more to know. And we did like a whole 2-page explainer. And side dish gems. I think that for vegetarian cooking, there are like all of these gems that are in side dishes, and you can build side dishes and have an entire menu of side dishes, like Korean banchan. I find that in my life now, my husband and I eat more side dishes than anything else. We eat the sides first before we eat the mains. And so that was really cool. Now, I'll tell you where I really had problems was with the mains chapters. For the sake of this being a vegetable-centric book, I have one chapter, I keep them apart. One has meat and one doesn't. Because you know what? It's like, I want to honor people who are total vegetarian or vegans. And then for people who want a little meat, there's a chapter for them. But trying to figure out how to title those chapters is like really hard. So sometimes like I love alliteration. So that's where you get mains without meat. So it's like a little, there's a cadence. And I say all the titles aloud to myself.
Oh, that's a really good tip, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm like, mains without meat. And then the ones that have meat, I started out with low meat mains. And I was like, that sounds boring.
Sounds like a diet or something.
I was like, I know, deprivation time, right? But then one morning, or maybe I was in the shower or something where I get most of my most brilliant ideas because I'm more relaxed. I was like, veggie packed mains, because that's what they are. So it's a matter of like really, coming up with phrasing, little catchy things that drive the content of the chapter. I'll share this, and it's in the rice chapter introduction, is that rice is typically at the end of my books and at the end of a lot of chapters because it's like, oh, it's a side. But when Lorena read my chapter introduction, she said, you're always saying that rice is so important. Why don't you put that chapter at the beginning of the book close to the front? And she goes, I'm just suggesting.
As a user, many of these are pretty quick. Some of these are quick dishes, and often you're going to get the rice going. If you're just having straight up rice, you're going to get that going before you cook the sides. So, having your rice up front, and you're going to need to go to it all the time because, like you said, it's going to be in every meal. So it does make it. I love that.
Agree. Yeah.
Yeah. But it was, it's like, oh my God, I'm taking a risk.
It is funny. Like, I can make my own rules.
Well, and speaking of having fun, so the rest of the chapter titles, they're fun, they're creative, they're evocative, but you play around language too in the recipe methods themselves. Like the method has subheads: cool and tweak, wait and wait, meaning to wait something, put a weight on it, and then let some time go by. And instead of saying shelf life, you say lifespan. And they're not standard either. You play around with these things. And I'm just wondering, like, working with your copy editor on this, was that a challenge? Because we know how copy editors like to standardize things. And it's like, wait, you said cool and tweak here, and here you said cool and taste, and, that sort of thing.
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up, too.
It's like you know this podcast, Andrea.
I'm a little familiar with it. The thing is that here at Everything Cookbooks, we talk about coming up with a roadmap, a template for recipe writing. And in the past, I would write these notes for my recipes that have like little tips. I remember years ago, I looked at an Ottolenghi cookbook. They had their notes organized with little icons. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So there was an icon for like, how long you keep something. Or I think I also like bakeware or cookware. And I thought, well, that's cool. But the icons are hard because icons don't always stand out to people, okay? Words are better. And so I came up with like 5 terms for different kinds of notes that I would provide to people. So this is where I created another set of parameters for myself, because I thought I'm going to give folks like little cues, but they're organized so that they can scan through the book. And whenever there's a note that has like something on lifespan, then they're going to go, oh, that's about, how long I can keep something, or maybe make ahead timing tips. There have been, again, nothing I do is all that new. Carla Lallie Music does a lot of this in her books. So I thought, well, that's very interesting. And Dory Greenspan has for a long time had playing around in her notes. So I thought I can create like 5 categories that I organize those tips in, and then just like that way I just push them out. And my copy editor, sometimes they would see something that I discussed in ingredients, like, oh, you can use this ingredient, blah, 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 blah. And Doug actually said, that's a variation. So they were actually, once that they got into that rubric, then they kind of understood it and they were trying to help me with it. Yeah, sometimes I have learned to work with my copy editor. He's a production director. We now have a very positive relationship.
Well, it seems that the thing that you have to do in these situations, and I think this is a great takeaway, is that if you're going to have, say, 5 different parameters for notes, be clear up front. You're not going to get your copy edits back and say, oh, by the way, you should have known that I was doing these 5 different types of notes. You really have to be proactive if you're doing something that's specific to your book. So, I mean, that's a really good note.
And Kate, thank you for saying that, because on Vietnamese Food Any Day, I had done some of these kinds of separation of categories in the notes, and I did not speak up loud enough.
Oh.
And the copy editor actually deleted all of them.
Oh my gosh.
Wow. I did not know that.
Yeah.
Wow. That's a lesson for all of us.
And then I also was not as disciplined in terms of how I created those categories for Vietnamese Food Any Day. So I was willing to let that go. And again, for people out there writing cookbooks, sometimes you let certain things go.
Right.
And you're just like, I'm going to fight that battle another day, my next book, and I'm going to win it. And I'm going to win it because I'm going to be organized. So this time around, I said to Lorena, I sent her samples of my recipes, and I said, this is what I want to do. I want to organize things in the note section so that readers get a very consistent, set of tips from me, tidbits that I can't fit anywhere else.
Well, also it's lifespan, it's variation, it's equipment. And those are all things that can end up in your head note. And then your head note can become a hodgepodge because you're like, oh, I want to throw this and I want to throw that. I want to share this. And as the teacher that you are, there's so much of that. So if you pull those out, it allows you to have your head notes can be as they are. They're clear, they're entertaining, they're informative without being bogged down with this sort of what would seem repetitive if it kept coming up in each one.
Exactly. And when we spoke to Andy Baragani, he talks about how he works on his head notes, and his head notes are tend to be very short, but he's like, I don't want to always touch on the same things over and over. And so we all know we want to provide so much information to cooks in our head notes. That's the introduction to a recipe. And if you've worked long enough to develop a recipe, you've got a lot of information to impart. But sometimes that's just TMI
Right.
in the head note. And they just want to, really get to it. And then you're like, well, where do I put that information that's packed into my brain? I don't want it to go to waste.
Mm-hmm.
So one of your head notes that really stands out, and it's one of the recipes too, the QP mayo, letter QP, which is a play on QP, but it's something that Rory named, your husband.
Yeah.
And
my white husband, he's
And you talk about him a little bit in the book. You talk about how he's can be your harshest critic, and we can relate to that. But we don't often talk about the roles our family members play in the writing process. I love that you bring Rory into this. And what role does he play?
He is my harshest critic. He will proofread and edit for me. Food is not his thing. He's a political scientist, so he tends to think about things in a different manner. But over the years, and we've been together for decades, he has a sense of what I'm looking for. Oftentimes when we talk about our families and food, there is this kind of gauzy, romantic quality about it. My relationship with my mom isn't really one that's romantic. We are friends in the kitchen, and sometimes there's tension. Because she'll say to me, well, that's an interesting way to do it. Or, vegetarian Vietnamese food just really never got my thing going. It didn't really inspire me, my mom said. And so she's highly skeptical, but she's willing to have me lead her, to let me experiment on her. So there isn't that kind of thing of oh, I learned, this from my mom and she's been such an inspiration. She has inspired me, but she has also challenged me. And my family members do that. And they've always let me experiment on them ever since I was a kid. And it wasn't always, easy. They just didn't eat everything I put in front of them. So with certain recipes, for example, the QP mayonnaise, I was like, I really can't say this is a KEWPIE, but Rory looked at it and he goes, oh, it's so fast to do. Just call it quick prep. And I was like, you are a brilliant man.
Genius.
There's my
Yes.
QP. But another recipe, I say he's my harshest critic because this was his vegan Vietnamese bologna recipe for something called da lua, or za lua. And it's like the Vietnamese cold cut that we put in sandwiches and we eat with noodle soups, all kinds of things. And that also took me forever to make. I think I made that for about a month. Oh. And he has eaten it so much during our time together as a couple that he would taste things and he'd say to me, not good enough. You could do better. That's not the flavor. That's not the texture, until I got it right.
Wow. Yeah.
I know. Harsh, right? I mean, we all have those people.
Oh my gosh. I have that. And my own husband is that way as well. I mean, he has a certain way of delivering.
Right. Is this dinner or are we developing recipes? That's what we need to know before we get into criticizing. Yeah.
And there was a recipe that I didn't include in the book and I'd worked so hard on it. And he just said, don't put it in there if it doesn't work for you, if it's not good enough for you. I mean, you really have to, again, going back to what we were talking about, respect the fact that people are first of all, they buy the book or they check the book out of the library and they're willing to entrust you to take them on some cooking project. And you want them to arrive at a place where they're happy or relatively happy. And I wouldn't put a recipe in my book that I didn't think was serviceable to my own friends and family.
Thank you, Rory. Doing this hard work.
I'll pass that on.
So, Andrea, you've worked with 10-Speed from the beginning, right? 18 years since your first book.
Yeah.
And I think many serial authors move around, and you have not. You've stayed with one publisher. You've had different editors over that span. You know, what would you say some of the benefits and challenges of having such a long-term relationship with one publisher? I mean, do you ever think about maybe I should go, move?
I've thought about it. I think that anyone who has been with a publisher for a long time thinks about leaving. I was lucky to land at 10-Speed to begin with because one of their specialties is cookbooks. And they make high-quality, brainy cookbooks that stay around. They also make really fun cookbooks, but their cookbooks are always quality, books that people return to over and over. So they are evergreen. And they have like some of the best people involved in making books. It's not easy. I've been with that publisher through a lot of changes, managerial changes, ownership changes. I've been through changes in editors. There's a familiarity with how the house runs. And if you are comfortable enough with the deal that you got with your publisher and what you were able to produce from that contract, then stay. And if you feel like you didn't get what you wanted and there was no room to negotiate for something better, and that's the first right of refusal on your next contract, then you can shop your book elsewhere. There was a point in my career where I did try to go somewhere else, and I've considered going elsewhere. But, for the time being, my longtime publisher is kind of like my family. We push each other around and we respect each other. And I think that that's the kind of relationship that you eventually want, because the bookmaking process, especially cookbooks, is not easy. I've talked to a lot of people recently who had never done cookbooks before, who were like really good writers, and they're like, I didn't know how hard it was.
Yeah. It's like writing is hard, of course. And there's all these other things like the recipes and the testing and then like integrating photography and the design. And
yeah, I mean, Kristin, you write in your newsletter about teaching people to write a proposal and setting parameters for people to just make these benchmarks, and that's just like you working alone in your little hovel, called the home office, and setting those parameters for yourself. That's one thing. But once that you send it to the publisher and the bookmaking process begins, it's like game on, man. You better like be ready for a lot of things to move.
Yeah.
And it's not easy.
Yeah. You've been in this game for so long, and it's just this ever-changing landscape, publishing culturally, and then media-wise. You've had to promote a lot of books. I'm wondering, this time with promotion, are you doing anything different, and how has promotion changed?
It used to be, starting out, that I wondered, like, do publishers really want to sell books? Because it seemed like the promotion was so passive. Send out a bunch of press releases, and a bunch of books to folks. And then that was it. And then now that we have the social media landscape, influencers, and also galleys, bound galleys used to exist in the past, and they're not. I received one bound galley recently from a very big book, and it was bound and it looked like a PhD dissertation, kind of like it was a big book. Yeah. Kate, you're like, whoa. I was kind of overwhelmed when it landed in the mail because I was really expecting a PDF. So now we send out a lot of PDFs, and there are a handful of bound galleys, I think, at some point in the publishing process. But it's much more proactive on the publisher's part. With 10 Speed and Penguin Random House, I work with a lead publicist, David Hawk, who reaches out to media. I also have a woman named Andrea Portanova, who is a marketer, who works with me on different, more online promotions and stuff. And there are sometimes advances that are sent out with different kind of cool food-related swag. You know, there's like, you can do so much, you know, sweepstakes, partnerships, collaborations. It's really, really fun. Debut authors are doing stuff, so it's not just someone like me who's well seasoned. But every single book, because there are years in between books, and I hope that for people who are listening to Everything Cookbooks, that you have, you know, a lot of cookbooks in the making for yourself or a long-term career. Know that between books releases, it's a lot of years, and a lot happens, and every single time it's different.
Yeah.
And it's exciting.
It's like, do you write? And it's like you come up for air and then you're like, now what am I going to do to promote this book or something?
Exactly. And all of a sudden they're like spreadsheets.
Right. Well, and Andrea, one of the things that you're also doing, we talked early on about your first proposal that you wrote, and you called it Please Pass the Fish Sauce, I think. And now that has a new life. Can you tell us a little bit about your new Substack?
So, okay, so it was one of our earlier, if not the earliest segment of Everything Cookbooks, right? Where we talked about our background. And I said that my initial cookbook proposal for a Vietnamese cookbook was called Pass the Fish Sauce. And you were like, oh my God, awesome title. You know, I think Kristin said, merch that.
Yeah, merch it. We need merch.
And I just held on to it. I launched a Substack late last year called Pass the Fish Sauce. And it's just been such a pleasure to write on that Substack platform. I'm not here to sell anybody on it, but that title back in 2005 when we were considering it for my cookbook was just so damn out there. It's like, what? You're going to tell people to pass the fish sauce? And people like think fish sauce is gross.
If they even knew what it was.
Exactly.
I mean, right? Some people.
Exactly, right? Now, in 2022, 2023, it's like, oh, fish sauce. Oh, yeah, no big deal. It's my umami friend, my stealth ingredient. And so I came out with that newsletter, and it became a paid subscriber newsletter recently. And I'm just so excited that many people are into joining me to, you know, really explore Asian cooking. Yeah, Pass the Fish Sauce is more than just about Vietnamese food, but it's really about kind of exploring the connectivity between cuisines. And yeah, fish sauce plays a big big role. And something like Substack allows writers to write without the hindrance of, honestly, advertising, which is how some of us make money. But we got to find different ways to make money because writing cookbooks isn't, I don't know. I just haven't seen, you know, those golden coins rain down on me yet.
You know, I love what you say about Pass the Fish Sauce because there's a graphic on your, I don't know, it's somewhere on your Substack. And it's the old newsletter was just you, microphone projecting out. And then the other graphic, what the Substack newsletter is allowing you to do is it's being part of a community. And so much of what you've done through your work and what this Evergreen Vietnamese really reflects is your interaction, your ongoing conversation with your community, from your survey at the beginning to how, you know, what the book would be about, to how you work with your community of volunteer recipe testers, to your hacks from other Viet cooks. It's just throughout, it's a through line through your work, Andrea, and it's really admirable. And I love to see that you found a place that it really feels like it supports that.
Well, thank you for noticing that. I think of myself sometimes as a loner. We do so much of our work alone. You know, and that's one of the reasons why we started Everything Cookbooks is to connect with other people. When I launched my website, Viet World Kitchen, back in like 2004 or something like that. It was really to create this sense of community. I didn't even know what it was. I just wanted people to talk about Vietnamese food because I had no one to talk to. I was living in the countryside. And over the years, it's grown, and then now it has seen itself play out on Substack and continues to grow that way. It's absolutely fascinating to me. I'm like a participant observer. People come and they have questions, and I hope to get people to contribute ideas to the Substack too. I see that in social media as well. Sometimes when we do promotion, we seem to think like, oh my gosh, it sucks up so much time. And it does. But as writers, we're no good unless someone reads our work. Mm-hmm. And in the past, you wouldn't often get the opportunity, right, to see what people did with your recipes. Mm-hmm. But now, that's the thing. I mean, I want to see what people do with my recipes and ideas that they have and the dialogue that we can have. So, Pass the Fish Sauce allows me to do that on Substack, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. It's this ongoing thing. It's kind of amorphous. But you just got to grow it and see what happens.
Yeah. Putting the social back in social media. I've been thinking a lot about that. Trying to think of social media as this like community and engagement platform rather than like
broadcast.
Yeah, broadcast. Exactly.
Yeah. There's a lot of, algorithm talk out there. And sometimes you just need to step away.
100%. Yeah.
And then sometimes, dive in. It'll always be there for folks. And I think that promotion is something that authors, we tend to just think, well, there's my work, here it is. I'm serving it up on a platter for you. But you really need to present it to people and remind people that you're there and what you do is valuable and what they do is valuable too. You get ideas from them. In the end, very much a win-win situation. Not just the pronunciation of my last name.
I was going to say. Well, you are winning with Evergreen Vietnamese. We're really happy for you.
Congratulations.
Big congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. Send us questions or comments through our website, everythingcookbooks.com. You can find more episodes on our website or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you like what you hear, please leave us a review. Any book mentioned in the show can be found on our affiliate page at bookshop.org. Thanks to our editor, Abby Circatella. Until next time, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.